is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 351. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm getting hyped for this next week since
you got a big week coming up, buddy.
Oh yeah, we're both you and I are going to be in the booth at Grand Prix Indy in just a couple days.
Yep.
And from then we go back to Seattle, home for you, and not home for me, but where Worlds and PAX is going to be. So it's going to be a busy week.
Yeah, it is going to be a whirlwind of a time at PAX, and
a whirlwind, if you will.
And I will wish you the best of luck on behalf of all of our listeners, and of course me as well. Hopefully you smash it, man. I'm pretty excited to see that tournament unfold, the World Championship. It is one of the highlights of the year for Tournament Magic, and Luis is going to be competing, so we hope you'll watch. Also, we hope you'll watch the GP next weekend that you mentioned as well. That's Grand Prix Indianapolis happening. It is modern, and it is going to be brought to you, the coverage at least, by Channel Fireball. That's right. It's going to be me. It's going to be you, Gabby Sparts, and William Huey Jensen as the four commentators. I'm going to be with Huey. You're going to pair off with Gabby, and we're going to be covering that event. So if you're a fan of modern or just like watching Tournament Magic, we do hope you'll check that out. And of course, the reason I bring it up is because Channel Fireball also sponsors this very podcast. And we hope that you'll check out their website as well. You can buy Magic cards there, anything you need. You can get singles, you can get sealed product, you can get supplies, sleeves, play mats, t-shirts, whatever it is you need. Channel Fireball is going to have it. And of course, you get awesome free content. This is really one of the things that drew me to Channel Fireball in my early days of coming back to Magic, which coincided with when Channel Fireball came into existence, 2008, 2009, right in that range. And, I loved the content, and I loved that it was free. I could go on there and I could read content from great players, from local grinders all the way up to Luis Scott-Vargas, and I could, learn from that website without impedance of any cost or anything like that. I could just do that. And then, of course, you guys really started to popularize draft videos in a big way. And that was a big game changer for me because I started making them myself. And, a lot of that started with Channel Fireball. So please do check them out. You can get all that free content and, of course, all the Magic stuff I mentioned as well. This show is also brought to you by you. That's right. Directly from the listeners. For people that want to support the things that they love, there's a website called patreon.com. And we're on that site as well for the podcast. And you can find a lot of things that you like on there. Podcasts, musicians, cartoonists, all that kind of stuff are on Patreon. And it's a really easy and cool website. You go there and you decide who you want to support, how much you want to support them for each thing that they make. In this case, it's a podcast. And you can set a monthly limit, and you can pick any amount you want per podcast. It can be $1. And you get some cool perks, including a thank you card in the mail and some other neat bonuses depending on how much you end up signing up for. So please check it out. It's patreon.com/limited resources. One of the benefits of that, of course, is that you get to submit your Patreon question of the week. This is a thread that I start every couple of months, and I pick out questions from it as we go through. This one comes from Goblin Gravy.
That does not sound delicious.
I am not, as much as I like gravy. So Goblin Gravy says, how do you adjust your tactics when drafting and playing against less skillful / more casual drafters? F&M at my local shop is very low key, and there are many new drafters around. This means that certain signals, such as deceptively powerful commons, wheeling, might mean very little, and someone could be in one of your colors without you noticing because strong cards are still making it to you. What else should you watch out for when facing opponents who aren't as invested in competitive limited play, and how do you make sure the veteran comes out on top as much as they should? I thought this Goblin Gravy worded this very nicely, right? Because I think somebody a little less suave here would have said, how do you play against bad players? Right. But this is, I think, a much better way to look at it, which is that these are players that maybe don't take it as seriously as you. There's a lot of people that, for them, Magic is more of a game in the sense of like a board game or something like that, that you take it out of the closet every week or two, you play a couple of games against your friend, and then you put it back in the closet. You don't think about it anymore. Where for people like you and I, Luis, it's more of this sort of all-encompassing lifestyle choice or something, right? We take it a lot more seriously. And of course, our listener base does as well. But that doesn't, you will run into players that are there like, oh, I draft once every month. This is my once a month draft. I get out and I get to try it out. And Goblin Gravy here wants to know, well, how do you adjust your tactics against them? And I think that's a very relevant question, because you definitely see what Goblin Gravy mentioned here, right? Which is like, you see people at the local shop going, why is this Galvanic Bombardment still in this pack? Like, how did this make it all the way back to me? And everybody kind of looks at them like, I don't know.
This is the sort of question that it always does set off alarm bells a little, because when I hear this, I think like, I don't like losing to the local players who I think are worse than me.
Sure.
But I think it is reasonably worded, like you said. You sometimes are going to go and draft at a local shop where, a lot of the players are more casual. My best advice is to just play normally, play tight, do the things you would normally do. The reason I say that is you can adjust your play and maybe win a little bit more by, figuring out how to play better against people who aren't going to play around things, or drafting decks that maybe can take use of that. But I honestly think you should just practice as if you were playing against people who, the best competition, because you don't want to get into bad habits.
I agree. I agree with you.
I think you should just try to learn the best you can and try to do the normal things. And if you are in fact more skilled than your opponents, you're still going to win more. I don't think you need to like look for additional edge there. I was never a fan of that. So I guess it's not like the most actionable answer in terms of like, here's a way to get extra win percentage against people who are worse. It's more like just try to get into good habits and try to play tight and try to just identify the open color. Yes, it can be more difficult. Look, I've been in these drafts where you think that red's open. It turns out red isn't. There's the person to your right is just taking, they're taking the like fourth best common over the best common. So you think that the red is open, or you have to play against someone who's sitting next to someone who's never drafted before. So their deck is absurd. Like, yes, these things can all happen, but I think if you just try to practice what you're going to use more often in your Magic career, which is just playing as if all your opponents are quite good, then you're going to, long term, I think, see more benefits.
I think so too. The one piece of advice I would give when it comes to strategic play is I tend to default to the more straightforward lines of play. If I'm playing against somebody who I'm not really sure where they're at, right? Like I can't quite figure out if this player's, really great or if they're still learning. And, my general philosophy on that, kind of goes back to like when I play poker and such, which is that if I'm playing against somebody and I don't know yet at what level they're thinking, how they approach the game, that kind of stuff, I tend to take the more straightforward kind of equity line that I can. And then as you start to learn more about the player, you can start to adjust a little bit here and there as you see fit. But I agree with your assessment, Luis, that the best play is usually the most straightforward. The other thing that I think is interesting about this situation that people seem to forget about as well is that you actually have a very big edge going into this situation, even not considering the tactical side of things, right? And what I'm talking about is not tactically speaking in game, but the fact that you're, getting a huge advantage from the fact that which cards are better. Like if you just laid out your deck and you have a reasonable mana curve, 2 colors, good creatures, good cards, you're not putting a bunch of junky do-nothings in your deck. That already is going to get you a big edge. That's a big benefit to listening to a podcast like this, because we do talk about card evaluation so much, and it's a big pinnacle of being a good limited player. And you get that advantage by default because you're building decks with better cards, and you're going to see your opponents play cards that just don't, they're going to be like contingency plan. You're like resolves, right? Because you wouldn't want to put that card in your deck under most circumstances, but they don't know. They're like still learning. And so they're like, sure, I'll do that. And you're going to actually garner a significant amount of edge passively just by playing better cards than your opponent. And I think that takes a little bit less pressure off of the tactical side as well. All right. Crack a pack, Luis?
Oh, yeah. Let's crack some packs.
This one comes from Curtis. Thank you, Curtis. I appreciate it. I'm in my new place, Luis. And
you did move.
I did move, and I had to... I couldn't find a crack a pack because everything's boxed up, so I had to shuffle through a bunch of the boxes, and I found this one from Curtis. So thank you, Curtis. Strange augmentation, which means to change something for the better.
Look, so one day we're going to disagree on a pronunciation or maybe a definition, and
Now,
you'll be right.
I have to defend myself. I did not disagree. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. No, I have disagreed with you a couple other times and was wrong all those other times. But not knowing something is not disagreement, Luis. Black. Aura, enchant creature gets +1/+1, and if you've got delirium, it gets an additional +2/+2. Now, you could call it strange. I just call it bad.
I have never played this card, come close to playing this card, or seen this card in play, and I suspect that's going to be true throughout the life of the format. Like this is one of those actual zeros. So
what's the word for change something for the worse?
De-augment.
Next is Backwoods Survivalist, another Delirium card. This one's 3 and a green for a 4/3, and if you've got Delirium, it gets +1/+1 and trample. It's fine.
It's a fine playable.
Yeah,
we're not in a format where 4-mana 4/3 is baseline good, where it's just okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen this card be impressive. The trample really does push it over the top. Like
it definitely does.
I mean, 5/4 tramples are real cards. So if you're a deck that'll hit Delirium like even a third of the games, I'm happy having this in the deck.
Agreed. Next is Sigardian Priest. Of course, that's the tapper for the set. 1 and a white, 1/2, and you can pay a mana and tap it to tap target non-human creature. It's good. It's certainly our front runner here, I would assume. Taking it over Backwoods Survivalist, and I'm not even looking at Strange Augmentation.
Yeah, it's not very close.
Weirded Vampire. That's the 3 and a black, 3/3 with Madness for 2 and a black. It's fine. I still like the Priest better than it, though.
Yeah, it's part of a deck that wants it, like Madness, and it's good there, but it's not a card you want to take early. Basically, it's not like Twins of Morrow State, which is an actual payoff.
Right.
Like Weirded Vampire is just like, I'm putting this in my deck because I have some ways to discard it, so it's going to be fine.
Yeah, I've seen it be part of very good curve outs, right? Like we know that it you can play Olivia's Dragoons into Weirded Vampire, and that's pretty good. You've put 5 power out. Some of it's a little bit evasive. But again, I think the key point that you made there is you just don't need to take this card early, and you don't really want to take this card early. Iron Right's Cleansing is next. That's a sideboard card. 2 and a white for a sorcery. Exile target artifact or enchantment. All right, here's a good one. I've really liked this card. I think you did too. Spontaneous Mutation.
Yeah, underrated card. I think still flying a little under the radar. This is 1 blue for an aura that you can play at instant speed that gives a creature -X/-0, X number of cards in your graveyard.
Yeah.
And what this essentially does is it just kills one of their creatures in terms of attacks. Like, yes, they can have an 0/5 out and still block, but this does a good job of not only being very cheap, but also dealing with creatures larger than blue normally has good tools to deal with.
Yeah, and, really does well in 2 types of decks that I particularly like it in. One of them is a Flyers deck. You can use it on their, Backwoods Survivalists or whatever, and just basically completely take it out of contention. And you're not dealing with the blocking downside that you mentioned if you're attacking with Flyers in the air. And then the other one is actually the Emerge deck. I found it to be quite fine in, because basically with the Emerge deck, you're just trying to set up, something emergeable and an Emerge creature, and Spontaneous Mutation buys you a lot of time. And yeah, they usually do get to end up blocking, but by that time you don't really care because you've got this huge Emerge creature and it's usually a chump block anyway. Also, Emerge does have the ability to put a couple extra cards in the yard. So I like it a lot. Now, how do you compare it to Sigardian Priest? That's an interesting question.
Not particularly close. I would take the Priest.
The Priest is just better, right?
Well, any white deck, the Priest is better than Combustion or Mutation is in a blue deck. Mm-hmm. And not every blue deck even wants Spontaneous Mutation. So I would for sure take the Priest.
Stencia Banquet. This card's bad.
This of the low ceiling. This tuna red sorcery.
I forgot about that.
Damage to your opponent. You can only red vampires you control and draw a card. I have seen people die on stream to this card, but it is not a card I would advocate putting in my deck.
Wow. I don't know what you're referring to, but I have a guess. I know your style, Louise. I have a very strong guess.
Just making clever observations?
That was
my trademark at this point.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've certainly never lost to that card. Faithbearer Paladin, 4 and a white, 3/4, lifelink. It's a human knight. I still think this is a solid.
Go on.
I think it's a solid card. I think, for 5 mana, it's like, sure. I also have seen this card not make the cut in white decks. So to me, this is not a priority type card, but if you need a 5-drop or if you have human synergies, then I'm down for a Faithbearer Paladin.
I was hoping that you were going to contradict me and we'd say it at the same time, but no, this is like the definition of like a 5.5. Where
yeah, C
where,
plus
like,
city.
Yeah, you'll play this card and it'll be good in some decks. You'll also just cut it without a second thought in other decks.
Yeah.
Basically, if you need a 5-drop because your curve is a little too low, like and you need a you do need a couple cards to spend mana on in the late game, or you have a lot of ways to pump your creature, like you have Faith Unbroken or Equipment, whatever. Then yeah, this card does the trick, but it's not a card I'm excited about and not one I'm really ever taking in the first like 6 picks.
This next card's one I was kind of hoping would be better than it ended up being, but maybe predictably so. It's Geist of the Lonely Vigil. This is the 1 and a white 2/3 with flying, but it's also got Defender. But if you've got Delirium, it can attack. It just seems like a really nice card because it's a fantastic blocker for only 2 mana, really holding down the fort for you, letting you get to Delirium. And then once you do, it starts turning sideways. But I'll be honest with you, Luis, I don't think I've ever seen this card attack yet, and it doesn't seem to make the cut very often.
It's a really weird card because you need it in a deck that gets Delirium and wants like a defensive 2-drop. And there are just not very many decks like that anymore.
I know.
Because like even the Blue-White Spirits deck that has a bunch of flyers, that deck doesn't get Delirium, and it really does want its creatures to attack. It would really rather have Tattered Haunters and whatnot. So I have seen this card be okay, but it's very few decks want to play it.
The Luis Scott-Vargas special here.
I don't even know what this card is.
Give no ground.
Oh come on.
3 and a white instant. Target creature gets +2/+6 until end of turn and can block up to 7 creatures in your case, or any number as it actually reads on the card.
Despite the fact that this did deal 21 damage to my opponent, I would not advocate playing the card. A 4-mana combat trick is just too.
At the Pro Tour, by the way.
Yeah, I mean,
in a 3-0 deck, right?
Look. Limited resources. We've long established this is very much a case of do as I say, not as I do.
The flavor text on Give No Ground says, "Get behind me."
Exactly. Like you can almost guarantee that if we talk about a particular sealed strategy, I'll be doing the opposite at the next Grand Prix I play at.
Not on purpose, though.
No, that's the thing. Like, okay, this is like going to be in the middle of the crack pack, but here it comes because I've been kind of wanting to say this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I do some very different things in drafts or sealeds at like the Pro Tour or Grand Prix than I talk about on the show is a testament to how flexible Limited is. Like you can see in my draft videos, Marshall, you've drafted with me a lot of times. Like when we talk about decks here, those are the decks I like to draft. Like I'm not trying to like put different content out than what I actually do.
Oh, and you tried your damnedest in the second draft.
A little too hard, actually.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening though is that we can give you the 80-20 rules one we like to talk about. We can give you strategies that work in like 80% of the drafts, but 20% of the time, draft or unsealed, you're going to have to do something that's like almost the opposite because the circumstances change so much. So
yeah,
look, I didn't go into GP Atlanta. I wanted to put Blister Pod in my deck. I didn't go into GP Vegas wanted to play White Red Equipment in Modern Masters. These are actually specific things we talked about not doing the week before. It just happened. Those are the decks I got handed, and that's what you end up doing. You still should give yourself the best chance to win. So we're not trying to give you rules here. We're trying to give you guidelines to help you make better decisions. And that's why we love Level Up episodes so much. They're certainly my favorite, is we want to give you a framework to make great decisions. And part of that is knowing when the things we talk about don't apply.
Yeah,
so
totally.
That is how you end up casting Give No Ground. I'm just going to put it that way.
Yeah.
You should not be playing this card. It's not a good card. But I just had a very specific deck that had a lot of need for combat tricks, and I didn't have any besides this one.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair as well, there is a bit of a surprise factor element to certain cards like this, especially uncommons like this that you just don't see very often, where, I'll be honest, like I wouldn't play around Give No Ground, right? There's just not a scenario, right now where I'm just like, oh, my opponent could totally have Give No Ground here and blow me out. Like, I don't think that would really come to my head. I mean, I haven't seen it in play yet, So there is a little bit of that going on, especially if you've got alphas. All right. This is a big question here, Luis. This is I'm glad we opened this, and I think we have before as well. But this is kind of the burning question, I think, for the format right now. We've opened a murder here.
All right.
And yeah, so 1 black instant destroy target creature. But again, as we've mentioned on the show, the consensus is starting to form that black really is the worst of the 5 colors. Now, the thing is, saying that black is the worst of the 5 colors isn't super relevant, to be honest, because if they're all tightly packed together in quality, the difference between 5th and 3rd might only be a little bit, and then it's like whatever. Like it doesn't really affect your pick choice. But if we go back a couple of sets to BFZ, we had green that was 5th by a lot, right? Like it was kind of like the other 4 colors or 3 of the other 4. Mm-hmm.
Green and BFC was like the most outlier we've ever seen.
I've ever seen
in 20 years of playing limited Magic. Like if you had to make a graph of where all the colors landed, like in every single set, green would be like so far to the left there'd be nothing near it.
Yeah,
like it would just be absurd. It would be by itself for miles, because it, like when we had Owen Turtle on, he said that you should never play green. He was just being dead serious. He wasn't even like saying like green is bad. Yeah. He was saying you should literally never play green, and I actually agreed with him.
Yeah, which is super interesting because, the way that we approach things on the show here is we take a more analytical, scientific-ish type thing to these things, where we don't just say things like, well, black's the worst color, and then just leave it at that, because it's just not that useful, not that actionable. And I think a pick like this, Murder, here in our Crack-A-Pack, especially when we've already got a decent card here with Sigardian Priest and, as a solid pick, really does start to inform, well, how bad is black? Are we actually avoiding first pickable cards that are double black like Murder just to stay out of it if we've got a reasonable backup plan with Sigardian Priest? Or are we still willing to draft Murder and black, and it's not, so far back that, we're abandoning it as a color?
I'm definitely not on the camp of like, I won't take a black card, or I'll really strongly avoid black. I'm going to take Murder over Sigardian Priest, pick 1, pack 1. It's just a better card.
I am too.
I think that black, yes, it's the worst color, but it's not by that much. It's not by enough that you should take, a 7 over like an 8 or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And, and also, Murder, even though it's double black, is a card that you can play late in the game for great effect. It doesn't have to be cast on turn 3, and oftentimes you don't want to cast it on turn 3. So the double black isn't quite as oppressive as it looks, at least at first glance. Where if this was like some creature that rewarded you for attacking or something like that, where you really wanted to hit it on curve early in the game, then the double black starts to look a lot more oppressive, where this one is a little bit more flexible. And you can, black can be your secondary color, and you can still play a Murder in your deck. It's not the end of the world. Okay, so we've got a foil. It is Displace, which is 2 and a blue instant, exile up to 2 target creatures you control, and then you return them to the battlefield under their owner's control, which we're not going to pick. We have a double face card, which is, it's one I really like, though I'm not taking it over Murder, is a Cryptolith Fragment. This is the weird one. It's 3 colorless or 3 mana that enters the battlefield tapped for an artifact, and it taps to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Then each player loses a life at the beginning of your upkeep. If each player has 10 or less life, you transform it into Aurora of Emrakul, which is a 1/4 with flying and death touch that whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 3 life. It's a really cool card. I've liked this card from the very get-go as far as the design and like how it actually plays. It's a really neat card. I haven't found myself prioritizing it in draft, though I have played it a few times. I do think it's a playable card. I just haven't really found myself in a spot where I'm like, ooh, we got a Cryptolith Fragment. We're doing it. I'm kind of like, I'll pick one up if it's a little bit late and there's not a whole lot else going on in the pack.
I like Cryptolith Fragment. It is a weird card. It does a lot of weird things, but it's very powerful. If you have a deck that pressures the opponent, then I think the card's great. If you have a defensive deck, it's not very good.
I agree. I found myself in both positions, and it feels amazing when you get off to a quick start with the Cryptolith Fragment, and then they just have to look down at it. And, the control decks in the format, the slow decks, the dirtily trying to set up some combo, those all just cringe at this card because they know that they're just on a very specific clock. And, when it transforms, it hits really hard. I mean, it's attacking for effectively 4 in the air. It's just game over.
If it transforms, they're basically dead because they were at 10 to start the turn. Or
exactly. Yeah, so. 10 or lower. Yeah, it's funny. I did find myself in a situation where my opponent had me on, on the bad side of that equation, but I had a clip wings.
Yeah.
And I actually got rid of the cryptolith. Like if they just would have stayed an artifact, I would have died to it, but instead I got to actually snap it off. So there you go. We've got a rare.
I would hope so.
It's not a real card. It's Splendid Reclamation. 3 and a green sorcery. Return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped.
Yeah, this is not a playable limited card. So.
Unfortunately not. It's a sweet card, and obviously there's going to be, people going nuts on it, nuts with it in Commander and that kind of thing, but unfortunately for limited, it's just not really worth it. So murder it is.
Yeah, you can take murder. The next person is going to take Sigardian Priest. Gets a little messier from there, and that's a fine place to be.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. I still like taking a murder. Okay, let's get into this episode. I actually haven't mentioned what we're going to talk about on the show this week. Sealed. That's right. One of the big pieces of feedback that we got, Luis, the last time we asked, was that people really wanted sealed. And, with the advent of sealed leagues on Magic Online, it really has pushed sealed into this nice little spot where people can play a bunch of sealed. It's not like the type of thing where, the occasional PPPTQ or, local tournament, weekend tournament or whatever is going to be sealed deck. It's like, no, you can actually just jam sealed. Like you have incentives to get good at sealed and just play them on Magic Online. And then, I always mention as well that it also is relevant for basically all forms of tournament limited Magic, right? Your PPTQs and that kind of stuff. GPs are going to be in sealed on the first part of it usually. So we like to cover that for each set. So
and
we
like to do it early as well. Like
yes,
we won't always be able to get it in the first couple of weeks, and here we're on week 4 of Eldritch Moon or so. Mm-hmm. But we're going to try to get it in the earlier part of the schedule rather than later because we know that that's when a lot of seals get played. So
exactly, and so we try to get that in. Basically, the routine ends up being that we do the set reviews, then we do initial impressions, then we do kind of another as things start to shake out, maybe break down some archetypes and start to get into the nitty gritty as we start to really form a view on what the format looks like, and then we'll turn our gaze over to the sealed side of things. And we'll get into that. And that's what's happening this week. So let's get into it. Where should we start, Luis?
The first thing I'll start is something I did for this particular episode, which I thought was pretty useful and I will likely do going forward. And that is actually what I could call analytics, as in I took a look at all the 4-1 and 5-0 decks from the Magic Online Shadows over Innistrad Champ qualifiers. So these are competitive 5-round sealed tournaments where the 4-1s and 5-0s qualify for a championship.
Yeah, this is great stuff, man. I did not know that they published the lists from those champ things.
Yeah, well, the only reason I found out is because I was looking for standard and modern deck lists, and I had to keep scrolling by all these sealed tournaments. There's 10 in a row, and then there's 2 more construction tournaments, then 10 more sealeds, and I was just wait, this is a lot of info. So I actually looked through basically all of them, and what I was looking for is I'm looking at this large quantity of data where any individual deck doesn't really matter. If I see a card in an individual deck that has not very much relevance, but what I thought was interesting is trying to spot the trends that I could see overall, because our normal way to prepare for this episode is to do a couple sealed leagues, talk to some people we know who play sealed, and kind of figure things out from there. And that's good. We still did these things, but that gives us not the whole picture. That just gives us what we get to see, what we play against and what we play, which is good. I mean, that's real information. But by going through these hundreds of deck lists, I actually got to pull out some stuff which I think is very relevant. So the first things I want to look at is, what is your average opponent's deck going to look like? What are you going to face when you play sealed? Mm-hmm. The big one is it's likely going to be white. It's more white deck than any other color.
I see that. I've seen that as a trend lately for sealed in general, by the way, and I'm not surprised by it. White tends to have the most straightforward playable cards, I should say. White hits the cross section of decent creatures and removal spells better than most of the other colors, as far as things that kind of jump out at you.
White just has a deep roster and tends to have enough high-powered commons and uncommons that it's got the combination of the standouts and the role players, whereas other colors frequently, like all the colors are playable in this format, by the way. Every color is represented pretty well. White's just the most common, but like some other colors have good high end, but just don't have very much in the middle, and white just has it all.
Yep,
Blue,
exactly.
blue, I think is the worst color. It doesn't have great high end or all that many playables. So
yeah, and a lot of the tempo style cards that you see out of blue lose a little bit of their luster when you're dealing in a format that tends to be a little slower, which we'll get into as well. You've seen a lot of splashing, people sticking to two colors. How does that pan out?
So yeah, your average opponent is playing white, and they're playing two colors.
Okay.
People do splash. I mean, that is a thing, but the vast majority do not. And the reason for that, we're going to get into a little bit later, but basically is that there's enough playables. Like you don't need to destabilize your mana base when you just can have 27 playables in two colors already.
Right. Now, as far as, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to move on to the next point.
Yeah, so I was going to say, one trend that we see out of sealed, and when we did our episode on sealed deck more in general, is that you tend to see the format slow down, right? You see fewer aggressive decks. It's just harder to piece together all of the pieces that you need for sealed deck. And I was wondering, well, is that the case here too?
It's not the case in this format. I think this format actually has a pretty good range. So
okay, so you can play some aggressive decks and you can also play some control decks.
Yeah, the baseline is to play a control deck.
Okay.
But aggressive decks aren't completely forbidden.
Okay, that's interesting because a lot of the sealed decks, they kind of feel that way, right? Like they're not literally, but it's like so uncommon to have them actually piece together a good curve with the stuff that you want. But that's actually pretty promising if we have one that you can actually play those decks in.
I wouldn't recommend it. It's not like I would start there, but there's enough good support that you can build a 2-color deck with a low curve and enough tricks that you can actually punch through. But I would say that your opponents are generally not going to be aggressive. They're generally going to have 4 more removal spells, multiple unconditional removal.
Okay.
And remember, I'm looking at the winning decks. So you're going to play against people whose decks don't fit this. Well, among winners and losers, but even among the decks that aren't winning, you're gonna see some things that don't match here. But the decks that winning just tended to fit this profile, which is to have a couple unconditional removal spells and a couple more removal spells total. So people are building decks that can kill almost anything you play. So
I think that's a really big part of the equation here, right? Like some formats give us unconditional removal and some don't, right? And that really pushes things in one direction or the other as far as bombs go. But here, even at the common level, even though it's expensive and clunky, kind of what we talked about last week with how removals changed, you do have multiple different ways to just get rid of anything, at least even if it keeps it on the battlefield or whatever, your choking restraints and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of these around, right? I mean, it feels like the check and balance on the bombs versus removal thing is in a pretty decent spot here.
It is the sort of thing where they're going to have answers to all your stuff, but you can't expect them to have great answers to everything. Like, yeah, they're going to have a bunch of removal, and some of it's going to be unconditional, but it's not. They're not going to have an infinite amount of it.
Okay. With that being said, what should your deck look like?
Well, one more thing I want to mention is I saw about an average of between 1 and 2 artifacts and enchantments and everything.
Oh, interesting. What kind?
So choking restraints is the most common because it's
all right. Sure.
The best white common, and white's the most played color.
Mm-hmm.
Equipment. There's people were playing in the winning. Like again, these are the people who went 4-1 or 5-0 played a lot of cultist staffs and true faith censors. And then the people who were playing blue were tended to play spontaneous mutation and sleep paralysis.
Okay, yeah, they needed those removal spells. And then that's interesting as well to hear about the equipment. We'll probably talk about that in a bit. But, there's a, mana sinks or it can be a big deal later in the game.
And relevant, too, is if you have to, put a root out in your deck, tune a green, destroy an enchantment artifact, investigate, it's going to have a target more often than not.
Yeah, okay.
So
that's interesting. So you would actually lean towards, if you had a questionable slot, you may main deck one of those.
I think it would be more like my 23rd, but it's not something that you can't do. It's something that it's worth considering to fill out your deck.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is that that's the kind of thing that I think it's easy to say, right? Like, oh, you might want to run one of these in the main, or maybe, you know, or it's right on the border or whatever. But what I found is that the way that they design sets and more specifically cards these days is that I'm never hard up for playables in a sealed pool. Like, I always feel like I'm making cuts, you know, pretty deep, you know, 26, 27, 28 cards that I could at least consider playing in my main deck. So the question is, like, if you're going to play a naturalized style effect, you have to really want it, right? I mean, it's going to replace a card. It's not, you know, it's not like, well, I've just got this empty slot here, you know, I guess I'll just throw a naturalize in. Like, you have to actually decide, I'm putting this card in my deck for a reason.
Yeah, you're not going to end up with a floating slot very often, and I think that you're right to point that out. But another like corollary here is cards like unsubstantiate, like a bounce spell, get a little bit more valuable when there's a lot of, like, first of all, negative auras they put on your creatures, like choking restraints or equipment in general. Like, you're going to have more of a chance to get value out of that. So
that's a good point.
Even I normally wouldn't play a bounce spell in sealed, I do lean towards playing them here.
Yeah, you know, when we talked about bounce spells before on the show, you know, I've mentioned that when I play them, my intention is to try to generate a 1-for-1 with them. And if there are, you know, a lot more of these enchantments that are removal floating around, and if there are more equipment, then if I'm not going to get a 1-for-1, I want to get a tempo just blowout. And, you know, equipment is an invitation to that. So I could see that for sure, you know, being something that maybe you want to lean towards. You don't want to go crazy on those, but, you know, having an unsubstantiated might be worth it.
Yeah. So moving on, you know, what can you get from this? What should your deck look like? I think that after looking at all these, what I think your deck wants to look like is, again, you want to be 2 colors.
Okay.
I think you want to play 17 land.
I've played 17 in the decks that I did 2 leagues. I've played 17 in both.
And you know, that's like easy to say because that's the default like limited ratio, but it feels like 17 is going to be better than 18 in most of the time.
Yeah, I often play 18 in sealed, so. You know, that's a thing that I went back to 17 for both of these decks and feel like it was right.
Yeah, it's I think it ends up that there's enough like cycling type cards and enough ways to like hit your 3rd land drop that you'd rather just play 17, and especially since the curves aren't insanely high, there's not like tons and tons of like 6+ drops.
Yeah.
You want to have a lot of removal in your deck. That's pretty standard for sealed, but worth mentioning, and build for the long game. I think your average deck should not be aggressive, even though you can build aggressive decks. And equipment, again, True Faith Sensor and Cultist Staff, they showed up a lot.
Yeah,
and that's interesting to me because True Faith Sensor I think is good. We already thought that card was good. You know, not a huge surprise there. But Cultist Staff is one of the cards that probably made the biggest jump between sealed and draft. And seeing how many people played it made me think that the card probably has more merit.
Okay. Yeah. You know, and to broaden this point out, you know, you said built for the long game is how you got to approach your build. Right. And then, you know, you mentioned the equipment, and those two things go hand in hand. Right. And, you know, one of the key points that I think of when I think of built for the long game are mana sinks, right? Places to put your mana that affect the game in a reasonable way. And there's quite a few of them, right? You know, the werewolves are one of the ones that we have talked about a bunch for draft. And I think that, you know, definitely hold their own here in sealed as well. And, you know, even things like hard casting emerge creatures comes up more often in sealed than it would in draft, I'm assuming. I mean, I've already done it twice and I only did 2 draft leagues, you know, and that's more, I haven't hard cast that many in draft, comparatively. So, you know, make sure that you have places to put extra mana as the game goes long. Another thing that I think about when I think of built for the long game I'm more willing to run graveyard recursion spells like Grapple with the Past, Cemetery Recruitment, Rise from the Grave. They can be hard to find a slot in your 23 because they're usually taking the place of a creature or a removal spell or something that you really want in your deck. But look, if you really do want to go deep into the game and be able to recur, you know, these cards can be pretty powerful, especially if you've got zombies and you play a Cemetery Recruitment. Like that's a very solid 2-for-1 value spell, you know, in the mid to late part of the game. And Rise from the Grave, you know, can help you leverage the fact that if you're the one that has removal spells, you know, your certain deaths and such, kill your opponent's bomb and get it back, as that's a win condition. Like that can actually absolutely do work. And Grapple, you know, I think the cat's out of the bag on that one. It's just a good card in general, but, you know, being able to use your graveyard as kind of a, tutor, like a mini subset of your deck that you get to tutor through late in the game can be a big deal too. So make sure that, when you're building your deck and you're keeping the long game in mind, that you have actual things. Like, it's not just about expensive spells. That's part of the equation. You do need powerful, expensive spells to help you finish up the game, but being good in the long game can come in different forms as well with these different types of mana sinks.
I do have to note that grapple is a card I'm always going to play because it's a split part of a land on turn 2. Like, you just get turn 2 grapple to find a land. The card's just excellent, and especially in sealed. So
agreed.
You should be grappling. But I agree on the other cards that are in this category. Like, you don't get a ton of slots for them, but it's nice to have a card like Rise from the Grave because it just means extra shots at getting a bomb into play.
Yep. And that can be the end of it, because like it's not going to be surprising, based on what you've seen and what I'm hearing from you here, that you play a bomb and it dies. Like that's going to happen a decent percentage of the time, just because people are playing removal spells that are capable. I keep going back to Certain Death, but that's the type of card I'm talking about that sometimes is a bit too slow in draft, or depends on the matchup how much you actually like the card. But if sealed is going to be a step slower, then Certain Death starts to look a lot better just as a catch-all.
Yeah, I do like counterspells in sealed, but I just want to mention Convolute specifically. Like, you question how good it was because it gets dead late game, and I completely agree. It's just counterspells are not intrinsically good, but they're good enough in sealed because the games are slow and people have not only do they have expensive cards you can counter, you can also just draw a counterspell on turn 10, and it's great because just if they draw a gas card, you could counter it. Convolute doesn't work in that second scenario. It does counter 6-drops just fine most of the time, but the fact that when you both have 7 or 8 lands in play, sometimes Convolute doesn't do anything, that's just too much of a liability. So
I agree.
I'm in the anti-Convolute camp here.
Yeah.
You can side it in, but you should probably not main deck it.
Yeah, I was wondering about it, because that was the question, is just like, I don't mind running a counterspell, but this isn't quite a counterspell. And man, I'm already feeling a little shaky about putting counterspells in my deck in Seal, just because there's scenarios and matchups where they really don't look good at all. And then you add in the downside that you just described on Convolute, and it's like, so you're telling me that I'm playing a conditional card that is going to be good enough most of the time, but then sometimes it doesn't even do anything? Like, I really wanted to at least just say counter target spell on it, with a period after it, and that's it. And then, sort it out from there. The other thing to note, at least for me, is that if I do end up running a Convolute and I get my opponent with it in one of the first 2 games, whenever we go to the next game, I'm much more likely to take that card out of my deck. Showing it to your opponent when you're both having the plan of going into the deep long game means that they have the ability to play around it at least somewhat. And, I'm looking for reasons to take that kind of card out of my deck. And that is just another one of those. If you're playing a tempo game where they kind of have to play cards into your open mana, then that's different. They don't really have a choice. But in these sealed games, they can go so long that sometimes they're like, look, neither of us have good attacks. We have a board, we're staring at each other. I'm just going to wait till I get enough lands to cast the spells I want to cast. And that's just, you don't want to be on the wrong side of that with a Convolute in your hand.
Yeah. I want to talk about splashing as well. Since it doesn't happen very often. Again, because of the thing you said, you're just like a glut of playables. So splashing, there are a couple ways to make it worth it. One is that if you have a lot of fixing, like the uncommon tap duels, Cripple Fragment, Weirding Wood, Warp Landscape, Terrarian kind of counts. But
I was going to ask you about Terrarian. Locking up a card in it is a little awkward.
It's the sort of thing that helps bolster a splash, but you should not rely on it because if you're red green splashing, some black card, and you draw your Terrarian with all mountains and forests in play, and it's like, well, I kind of want to get my card out of this, but then if I draw a black card, I can't cast it. That sucks. So you need to make it so the cost is low, which is again having a lot of fixing, and there's not a lot of fixing in the set, which is why splashing doesn't happen that often. You need to have great splashable cards. That's the other way that you end up splashing is when you have, basically as many 5 and 6 level playables, 5s and 6s as you can take, then splashing a 7 doesn't make much sense because you're going to lose more on the mana, out of front. If you're putting in a 10 all of a sudden or a 9, that does change things. Like, swapping C's for A's is a reason to splash. So if you have cards that are really worth splashing, then you can look at stretching your mana base a little bit. The part that's tricky though is if you opened a great splashable card like a let's say a Dark Salvation, because that card is very good even if you have no other zombies. Why don't you just look and play black? Like frequently you're going to be able to just play those colors. Like unless you have bombs over 3 colors and some of them are splashable, most of the time if you just have bombs in a color, you should just play that color. So
sure.
Splashing really has to have a couple things come together for it.
What about, okay, but here's another scenario. So that covers bombs, but what about if you're playing a deck that's missing something? You know, like let's say you're playing a blue-green deck and you just don't have removal, right? Like you've got like a Prey Upon and a Spontaneous Mutation or something, but like you just know if your opponent plays a 5/5, you're screwed, right? Would you consider... I guess the better question would be, you're talking about going from like a 7 to a 10 or, you know, this kind of range. How much higher is, let's say, a Certain Death? You know, a card like that in a blue-green deck that is providing you something that your deck cannot give you outside of that card. Does that change how you would say, like, is Certain Death just a 10 in the deck because it's doing something that your deck needs to do and can't? Or do you view it a different way?
When you need to fill a particular role, then yes, the value goes up. So Certain Death is a good example of a card that I would advocate splashing for. Mm-hmm. It's not powerful enough that I would splash it in your like average blue-green deck, but if you just happen to have like a dual land and a warped landscape or like a cryptolith fragment, then I'm a lot more amenable to it. Like it does actually do the thing that you need to do. Like I would not splash Token Restraints in a black-red deck even if I had good fixing, because black-red just doesn't need that effect.
Yeah, exactly. And you wouldn't be playing those 2 colors if they didn't have some of the removal spells that make it good. So yeah, you're reaching out for something that you don't already need. It's the same thing, you know, and there's other categories that this fits into as well. You know, game enders, you know, bombs at the top end are cards that, you know, you often can find in your own colors. They're not quite as splashy or flashy as the maybe the one that you could splash for. But, you know, hey, you know, if it's big and flies or whatever, you know, oftentimes that kind of card can just get the job done. So make sure you're really paying close attention to what it is that your deck really needs and that you can't get in the pool of colors or in the colors that you've chosen out of your pool, because there is a big difference there. And sometimes it is totally worth it to go for the splash for even a card. Again, like a Certain Death isn't, you know, it's not one of those cards that you're like, oh my God, it's great. But it's like, that really does fill that role nicely for color pairs that can't do it otherwise.
And the last thing I want to note when splashing is that I do like splashing the emerged creatures because,
yes.
First of all, they're all single color except for Lashweed Lurker. I mean, not counting like Decimator Provinces or whatever, or not counting the rares, but like they're single color except for Lashweed Lurker, which frequently you'll be one of the 2 colors. You'll be like black, green, and splashing the blue. So it only takes 1 color to splash them. They're very expensive. So you'll get your splash land late and be able to play them, and you can actually just cast them for generic mana. So the fact that these cards are castable for like 7 or 8 mana is actually really big, because that means that sometimes you just never draw your splash land, yet you can still just cast the card. Yeah. So, and they're all just powerful effects that you want in sealed. Like I'm not looking to splash, you know, It of the Horrid Swarm, but Lashweed Lurker, you know, or Drownyard Behemoth or Wretched Griff, these are the kind of cards that I would like to splash, because they're the kind of effects you want in sealed. So emerged creatures, I think, are worth splashing.
You know, I actually want to ask you something. So are there, I know this is kind of weird, but are there, like, let's just go down a few of the ones that you talked about. Would you play any of those if you could not emerge them? Would you play Wretched Griff?
Like straight up, just like
7 drop, just
you have no blue mana in your deck, 7 mana, 3/4 draw card.
Yeah.
That I don't think I would be looking to play these cards now.
Would you play Distended Mindbender then? Let's up the rarity.
No, Mindbender. Part of the reason I wouldn't play Mindbender is because the discard effect doesn't help. I would play Elder Deep Fiend for 8 mana. 8 mana, 5/6 tap 4 creatures at flash, I think is worth splashing. Or not worth splashing, worth playing even just a hard cast. Mm-hmm. But you do, I mean, when you put an 8 drop in your deck, you have to build your deck to play 8 mana spells. So that frequently means having more than just 17 lands. You have either an 18th land plus like another mana source or 2.
Mm-hmm. Am I missing any of them?
I mean, we talked about, like Lashweed Lurker.
But you said none of those ones fit the bill for you, right?
Not really, no. Vex and Scuttler, like these are not cards I would be looking to play in my main deck.
Okay, I'm just curious.
Without the blue mana.
Yeah, and then like how close, you know, because like I'm trying to obviously I'm getting a little nitpicky about it here, but I'm trying to dial into just how close it is. If you had a Terrarian in your deck, would that change your mind?
That might, because having outs is always nice.
I know it's so close, right? Like, I mean,
still probably, the thing is, like, look at a card like Wretched Griff. If it was a 6-mana 3/4 flying draw card, I would always play that in sealed.
Windmill it, yeah.
So how much worse is a 7-mana 3/4 draw card? It's not
about
that
2.5 turns.
Yeah, it is enough worse that I wouldn't play it, and one Terrarian probably isn't enough to get it in there.
Okay.
But
we're starting to pick it apart to get an idea for where your brain's at on it. Because the key here is that you want the non-emerge cost to be the backup plan, right? I mean, that's not your primary role here, is to just pay 7 or 8 mana for one of these things.
Well, it's the sort of thing where if you have like a good controlling black-red deck, and you have like Highland Lake, the blue-red duel, maybe you just play a Wretched Griff. Most of the time you're just going to cast it, but every now and then you're going to draw your mana and play it, and emerge it.
Yeah, see, that sounds correct to me.
It sounds right. I mean, I haven't tried that, so I guess I don't know, but it sounds right to me.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have to put in a little more work research and find out for ourselves. Let's talk about the format in a big picture perspective. Some of the things that occurred while we were playing our leagues and such. It feels pretty normal for sealed. Right? Like the bombs matter, there's answers, make sure you have your answers, etc. But, when we talk about generalities for sealed deck, we usually talk about it being a turn slower, not insanely slower, but slower. Everybody plays all their bombs. So all of a sudden, a lot of the games become a lot more bomb centric than your draft format, where a lot of times people don't even have a bomb in their deck. Removal then, of course, gets stepped up, where you need to make sure that you can answer the bombs, depending on, how they play out. And I gotta say that this format, at least at first glance, feels kind of normal. It's like, okay, yeah, this feels like a slower version of the draft format. And, along those same lines, it also kind of feels like an extension of the draft format to me. You do lose a little bit of the like white aggressive decks, and like the black-red madness decks and stuff like that don't come together so much. I'm sure it's true of blue-red as well. But in general, I do see little snippets of the draft format pop up here and there, where somebody will play a Mercurial Geist and get in there for 7 a couple of times or whatever. Even though their whole deck isn't built around it, they still will include these little 1-2 punches, a little madness here and there, that kind of thing. But yeah, overall, the overarching thing is that it definitely has felt slower, and it definitely has felt like I'm able to reach out a little bit further as far as like feeling good about playing those 6 mana or 5 mana removal spells and getting a little splashes and that kind of stuff.
It's kind of funny where frequently we'll do our sealed episode and kind of conclude with like, well, this feels like a normal sealed, and here's what that means. I don't think that means it's bad to talk about the sealed format, because some sealed formats are not that, and it's really important to know when it isn't.
Yeah.
But it feels like a lot of the sealed formats here are going to have, there's things that the truisms tend to repeat themselves. Like the fact that, removal and the speed of the format tend to slow down a little bit. These are just things that happen in sealed, but some sealeds are a lot more warped than others. So it's good to kind of just like check ourselves and make sure that we're in the same place. I like looking at all the different decks. I think that I'm going to do that moving forward, assuming that they're posted online.
Yeah. Do you think that is that a repeated, that championship thing? Is that something that happens in the same time frame every set now?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah. Cause that'd be great.
And I find it very useful, to kind of see what the format ends up looking like, just with like a lot more data points than just me and you playing sealed and talking to, other people who play sealed. But it is interesting to note, like, just, cards that get better, like equipment, for example, tends to get better, and Cultist Staff was one of the big winners. Mm-hmm. Kind of like what colors tend to be better. And that's always a tricky one too, because that goes back to the, like, yes, we can say white is the most played deck, but that doesn't mean you're going to be white 80% of the time. It just means you're more likely to be white. Yeah. So I feel like the sealed format is relatively straightforward, but it's enough different than draft that you do have to kind of approach it differently. You have to build your deck in a way that makes up for the fact that the games are a little bit longer, that people have slightly more good removal, that people have more rares on average in their deck, and figuring out how to deal with that is important.
What about the type of cards that are the big losers? You know, the ones that really like lose a lot of their punch. Like, you know, thinking of white cards, like where are you at on like Fiendbinder and Guardian of Pilgrims and these kind of cards that you'll see in the draft format relatively frequently? You know, do those translate to draft? Like, are you seeing those in a lot of the lists?
Those tend to get worse. I mean, that part of the shift to slightly higher curves and slightly slower games is that cards like Fiendbinder and Guardian of Pilgrims,
Steadfast Cathar, something. Okay,
certainly do get worse. And I don't even love those cards in draft to begin with. So
agree.
So we're ending up in a situation where I just don't want those cards in my deck very often.
What about like Lone Rider?
Lone Rider is an interesting one because it is such a high payoff, but I would not want to play Lone Rider if it meant playing medium cards to support it. Like, I don't want to play bad cards to support Lone Rider because my opponent's just going to put a choke and restraints on it, and that'll be the end of it.
Okay. And then, you know, looking at a different category of card, what about cards like Fogwalker? Like these 2-drop kind of semi-defensive 2-drops. Like, are these, do you see a lot of these in there, or are these just not on the right power level to see play?
Fogwalkers and the Wailing Ghouls and whatnot.
Yeah, those type of cards.
Tend to be cards you just don't want to play because people aren't playing their 2-mana 2/2s, so your 2-mana 1/3s have even less of a job to do than normal.
Right.
And normally their only job is to stop the other 2-mana cards. So you really don't want to be messing around with those. Like, you want your 2-drops to be ones that are good in the late game. You know, so you end up valuing the 2-drops that can do that a little bit more highly.
Okay. So. And keeping an eye on those. All right, cool. Well, I think that's pretty good. Like, I just wanted to get, you know, kind of a snapshot of the format for Sealed. I think that's really cool that you found those lists, though. I you know, that's a way that we can be basically increase our own sample size, you know, sort of, right? Because we can see what's actually winning, and that definitely indicates a lot about what's going on with the format. So I think we should do that going forward.
Well, I was looking at it now. So when you say we, does you mean I would do it again?
Well, I if you would have sent it to me, I would have read it, but I didn't actually know it existed until we were prepping for the show beforehand. But I'm really glad that you found it because
it's just the next killer app is the thing.
God. All right. Can we be done now? Yeah. So let's wrap it up there. I'm actually kind of excited to play the Sealed format. The 2 decks that I did build, I was quite happy with. I built a blue-black control deck, which was my favorite one of the 2. And I'm decided to push very hard in a control card advantage direction just to see how that worked out. Because sometimes you get really punished for that. But I played all the card draw spells in my pool. I played Succumb to Temptation, Scour the Laboratory, or Scour the Dranyard, or whatever it's called. I played all of that stuff. I had to pour over the pages, and I was just like, all right, let's just draw all the cards and see if that works out, or if I get smashed by a bunch of Steadfast Cathars or whatever. And I didn't. It worked out quite well, in fact. And that...
Yeah, I mean, Tameo's journal it up. These are the kind of things you can do.
Yeah, I had that too, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm actually kind of stoked for it. And, you know, I got to say, ever since they started doing the leagues on Magic Online, like, that has really revived my interest in Sealed personally, just because, you know, I would play a lot of Sealed if I knew I was going to play in a Sealed tournament. But beyond that, if I go on Magic Online, they always had a Sealed queue. You could play the Phantom Sealed or whatever. And I would always kind of hover over it and then be like, I'm just going to draft. I prefer drafting to Sealed in general, but now with leagues, it's not the same. Like, I'll get on these weird binges where I'll just go like Sealed League, Sealed League, Sealed League, Sealed League, and, you know, kind of chain them together, especially once I feel like I start really getting a feel for the format. And I think that's really great, you know, because Sealed's a format that, as we said at the top, is actually really important. Okay.
Yeah, Sealed is good. I've liked some Sealed decks more than others, and I tend to like how this one plays. Part of it is I just like Eldritch Moon, so I enjoy the draft format, and the Sealed format plays well.
Yeah. And I mean, I know it's a little different for you because you do have to test for, like, you've got Worlds coming up or whatever. You know, you have to dedicate your time.
Sealed is one of the formats for Worlds.
Yeah, it is. You keep grinding on the Sealed deck. We'll see you in Seattle. All right, let's call it a show there. I want to remind you the show's brought to you by channelfireball.com. And also remind you, speaking of tournaments, Grand Prix Indianapolis next weekend. Make sure you check it out. Is it going to be on twitch.tv/Channel Fireball?
It is twitch.tv/Channel Fireball all weekend long.
Yeah, so that'll be awesome. Join us there. We've got a bunch of really cool stuff lined up for you for the coverage from there. And Modern, people love watching Modern, and Modern has had some major shakeups over the past 6 months or so. So it should be interesting to see where that format's at, and we look forward to bringing it to you. And of course, please check out the website, channelfireball.com, for everything you need Magic related and awesome free content. You can go check that out there. And if you want to find more about this particular podcast, lrcast.com is where you can go. You can find links to, all of our stuff. Luis's stream, my stream, the YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff. It's all there on lrcast.com. You can also find us on social media. I am Marshall_LR, and Luis is LSV. Pop on Twitter, say hi. We're there. And that's going to do it. We'll see you next time.
So what I want to talk about today is actually one of the most unique Grand Prix experiences I've ever had. It was, I think, colloquially known as GP Best Buy.
Yeah, this is before my time. I heard about this though.
Right, it's amazing. So Grand Prix Bochum 2010. I decided to go. It's a Grand Prix in Germany, and I normally do not go to overseas Grand Prix, but it was near the end of the season and I needed the points. 2 days before I left, there was an announcement published on the Wizards website. It was like, due to Germany's gambling laws, cash prizes will not be allowed to be awarded at the Grand Prix. Alternate prizes
for a Grand Prix.
Yes, alternate prizes will be made available. Like, I don't know what that means, but I'm going to the Grand Prix. I get on my plane, I get there. It turns out that because of anti-gambling laws, Wizards is not allowed to pay out in cash. So, instead of getting $3,500 for first, instead of getting like $400 for top 32, instead, because Wizards is owned by Hasbro, the prizes were basically a combination of like toys, electronics, and Magic paraphernalia. I'm not even joking. So I played the Grand Prix. It was a fun Grand Prix. I enjoyed it. I finished in the top 32. My prize for top 32 was a PlayStation 3, a gaming headset, so like a headset with a mic.
Oh my god!
A box of New Phyrexia, and a Magic T-shirt. I got to pick. It
sounds like Christmas morning, man.
I got to pick if the T-shirt was Mirrodin or Phyrexia.
Wow, that is unbelievable.
So, before the tournament, me and Martin Yuza made a split, and the split only took effect if one of us literally won the tournament. Turns out he won the tournament.
Oh my god, I didn't know you had a split with Martin.
Because we weren't winning any money. He won! Because we weren't winning money, the split was like, okay, how about this? If the winner wins the tournament, then the other person gets to stay in their free hotel, because here's what his prize was for winning the tournament. See if I remember all this correctly, because I'm not looking it up. He won a flat screen TV. He won a PS3 and an Xbox. He won a laptop. He won 2 plane tickets to a European Grand Prix and hotel at a European Grand Prix the year after, and the hotel was what we split. He won like 3 boxes or something. He definitely won the T-shirt. There's no way he didn't win the T-shirt. Everyone got the T-shirt. And he also, I think, won a headset. So we called it GP Best Buy because, like, literally it was like everyone who won got 10 minutes in Best Buy to grab whatever they could. So,
you supermarket sweeped Best Buy.
So that GP is the story of how I won a PlayStation 3 and a New Phyrexia T-shirt at a Magic tournament.